February 23rd, 2021, 9:47 p.m. Somewhere in San Jose, a Fry's Electronics employee got a text from a coworker. Check Twitter now. He did. In 30 seconds, 36 years were over. At its peak, Fry's Electronics was unlike anything America had ever seen. 34 stores, 9 states, 14,000 employees, themed palaces where UFOs crashed through walls, where Aztec temples loomed over aisles of motherboards, where engineers browsed until midnight and nobody asked them to leave. This was the holy land of American tech culture, the place where a generation of Silicon Valley's finest built their first computers, chased midnight GPU launches, and spent hours wandering aisles stacked floor to ceiling with every component ever made. Then, in a single night, it was gone. No bankruptcy announcement, no going out of business sale, no warning to the 14,000 people who showed up for work the next morning. Just a deleted Facebook page, a silenced Twitter account, and a website that went dark at midnight, leaving behind only a short farewell letter and 30 padlocked doors across America. How does something like this happen? Not Amazon, not COVID. The real story is stranger, darker, and far more human than any of that. This is Fry's Electronics. To understand how Fry's Electronics was born, you have to go back to a grocery store. In 1972, a California businessman named Charles Fry sold his regional supermarket chain, Fry's Food Stores, to the Dillon Companies for $14 million. It was a clean exit, a good deal, and the end of one family legacy. But Charles wasn't done. He took a portion of that money, roughly $1 million each, and handed it to his 3 sons, John, Randy, and David. What Charles probably expected was that his boys would invest wisely. Maybe start something safe. Maybe stay in groceries. None of them did. John Fry had spent years working inside his father's supermarket chain, not on the floor, not in management, but in the back office running IT systems. He understood logistics. He understood inventory. He understood how a large retail operation actually worked beneath the surface. But his real passion wasn't food, it was technology. And in 1985, technology in Silicon Valley was exploding in a way the rest of America hadn't yet felt. The engineers pouring out of Stanford, Berkeley, and the corridors of Intel and Apple needed parts, resistors, capacitors, transistors, memory chips, hard drives, cables, the raw materials of the digital revolution. And where did they buy them? Tiny, cramped, poorly lit shops that stocked maybe a fraction of what any serious builder needed. Or they ordered through catalogs and waited weeks. For a region moving at the speed of Moore's Law, that was unacceptable. John saw the gap, and John had $1 million. He called his brothers. He called a 4th partner, Catherine Calder, his former girlfriend, and a sharp business mind in her own right. And on May 17, 1985, the 4 of them opened the first Fry's Electronics on Arcus Avenue in Sunnyvale, California. The store was 20,000 square feet. That sounds large until you realize what they were trying to do. Stock everything. Not just the popular items, not just the fast movers. Everything. Every connector, every cable gauge, every obscure component that an electrical engineer might need at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday when a deadline was 2 hours away. The pricing was aggressive, the hours were long, and the selection was, from day one, unlike anything the region had seen. Word spread fast, the way word spreads in tight-knit technical communities. Engineers told engineers, hobbyists told hobbyists. Within months, Fry's Sunnyvale wasn't just a store, it was a destination. People drove an hour to get there. They brought lists. They left with more than they planned. They came back the following weekend. The Fry brothers had found something real, a customer base that was passionate, technically demanding, and deeply loyal if you earned their trust. By the late 1980s, a second store opened, then a third, each one bigger than the last, each one pushing deeper into the idea that a tech retail store didn't have to look or feel like every other box on a strip mall. That idea, that a store could be something more, would become the foundation of everything that followed. But it would also, decades later, become one of the things that made fries impossible to save. Most retail chains try to make their stores look the same. Consistency builds brand recognition. Uniformity keeps costs down. It's the logic behind every Home Depot, every Walgreens, every Best Buy that ever existed. Walk into one, you've walked into all of them. Fry's went the opposite direction entirely. Starting in the late 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, every new Fry's location was built around a theme. Not a color palette, not a logo treatment, a full, immersive architectural world, custom built from the ground up, designed to make you feel like you had walked into somewhere extraordinary. And they meant it. The Sunnyvale store, where it all began, paid tribute to its roots. Silicon wafer motifs, circuit board patterns embedded in the floors, neon traces running along the walls like the inside of a motherboard. It was a store that knew exactly what it was and wore it proudly. The Palo Alto location leaned into the American frontier. A Wild West theme complete with wooden facades, cowboy architecture, and the surreal image of resistor bins sitting beneath a saloon-style overhang. It was absurd. It was wonderful. Burbank went further. A 1950s science fiction theme, with a full-scale UFO crash landing through the exterior wall of the building. Not a small decoration, a massive, unmissable pull-over-and-take-a-photo installation that stopped traffic on the street outside. People who had never heard of Fry's walked in purely because they needed to know what was happening inside that building. Houston honored Texas oil history, derricks, roughneck imagery, the iconography of the Lone Star State built into every corner of a store, selling computer components and flat-screen televisions. Phoenix went ancient, an Aztec temple theme so committed that the store's designers installed hidden speakers throughout the building that piped in ambient jungle sounds. Wind, rain, the distant calls of tropical birds. As customers walked the aisles, you could be standing between two rows of graphics cards and suddenly feel, for just a moment, like you were somewhere deep in the Yucatan. The Campbell store south of San Jose was built as an Egyptian pyramid. Employees at certain locations wore themed costumes. The architecture wasn't suggestion, it was total immersion. And through all of it, through every outlandish facade and every carefully engineered atmosphere, ran the same inventory. Thousands of SKUs, components, peripherals, cables, software, appliances, books, magazines, snacks. The smell of fresh circuit boards mixing with popcorn from the in-store snack bar. Checkout lines that stretched and wound through cordon paths, sometimes 45 minutes long, and yet people stayed in them because leaving meant not getting what you came for, and what you came for existed here and almost nowhere else. This was the magic of Fry's at its peak. The themes weren't a gimmick layered on top of a normal store. They were the physical expression of a genuine belief that the people who loved technology deserved a place that loved them back, that buying a motherboard could feel like an adventure, that a retail store could have personality. Generations of engineers, coders, hobbyists, and weekend builders formed their earliest memories of tech culture inside these buildings. First PC builds sourced entirely from Fry's. Midnight launches where people lined up outside the UFO store in Burbank for a GPU that had just dropped. The strange, specific joy of finding an obscure component you'd been hunting for weeks, sitting right there on a shelf between two things you hadn't known you needed. Fry's competitors tried to match it. Incredible Universe, a Tandy spinoff, came closest, building large format experience stores in the mid-1990s. Fry's bought them out in 1996 and converted the locations. Circuit City and CompUSA competed on product selection and price, but neither could replicate what Fry's had built experientially. By the mid-2000s, Fry's had expanded to 34 stores across California, Texas, Arizona, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. The footprint was enormous. The brand was beloved. And the theme buildings, each one a massive, custom-constructed monument to a specific vision, stood as proof that the Fry family had built something genuinely unlike anything else in American retail. What no one saw yet was how much those buildings would eventually cost them. By the early 2000s, Fry's Electronics was operating at a scale that defied easy description. 34 stores, 9 states, roughly 14,000 employees on payroll, revenue estimated in the billions. Exact figures never disclosed because Fry's was a private company and the family intended to keep it that way. No shareholders to answer to, no quarterly earnings calls, no analyst coverage. Just the Fry family running one of the most distinctive retail operations in the country, entirely on their own terms. And what they were running was genuinely impressive. Walk into any Fry's at its peak and the sheer volume of what was on offer was staggering. Consumer electronics, obviously, televisions, stereos, cameras, phones, but also computer hardware at a depth no competitor matched. Motherboards, CPUs, GPUs, RAM, hard drives, power supplies, cases, cooling systems, cables of every gauge and connector type imaginable. Software, peripherals, home appliances, cosmetics, tools, toys, technical books, hobbyist magazines, snack foods, electronic components, individual resistors, capacitors, transistors, the kind of granular inventory that separated Fry's from every other big box store in America. If it ran on electricity, Fry's probably had it. That breadth was the core value proposition, and it created a customer base that was unlike any other retailers. Fry's didn't just attract casual shoppers, it attracted professionals. Engineers from Intel, Apple, Cisco, and Hewlett-Packard made routine stops at Fry's the way other people stopped at a hardware store. ET departments have sent employees to pick up last-minute components before a critical deadline. Hobbyists spent entire Saturday afternoons working their way through the aisles, comparing specs, handling products, debating options with strangers who happened to know more about the subject than most salespeople anywhere else would. The checkout lines were legendary, and not in a flattering way. 45 minutes on a slow day, an hour on weekends. Serpentine queues that coiled through cordon paths, staffed by rows of cashiers that still somehow couldn't keep pace with the volume of customers. People complained about it constantly. They came back anyway, because the alternative was driving to 3 different stores and still not finding everything you needed, or waiting a week for an online order at a time when waiting a week felt like an eternity. Fry's also understood its audience in ways that built deep loyalty. Stores stocked deep back catalogs of technical books that no general bookstore would carry. Magazine sections ran thick with niche publications, hobbyist electronics, PC building, audio engineering, amateur radio, titles that had no business being profitable in a retail environment, but were there because Fry's customers wanted them there. The snack bar near the entrance became a ritual. You grabbed something to eat, you settled in, and you spent real time inside the store the way people spent time in a place they actually wanted to be. Midnight launches happened at Fry's before they happened anywhere else in retail. New GPU drops, major software releases, customers lined up outside the Burbank UFO store, or the Phoenix Aztec Temple, or the San Jose location in the dark, waiting for a product to go on sale at 12:01 a.m. This was not behavior retailers manufactured. This was behavior that emerged organically from a community that had decided, collectively, that Fry's was their store. The competitor landscape made Fry's position look even stronger. CompUSA, once a serious rival in computer hardware, began its long decline in the mid-2000s, eventually shuttering all 103 locations by 2008. Circuit City, which had competed aggressively across consumer electronics, collapsed entirely in 2009. Incredible Universe was already gone, absorbed into Fry's years earlier. The field was clearing. What was left at the peak was something that felt permanent. A retail institution built over 2 decades, anchored by real customer loyalty, operating 34 giant stores across America's most tech-dense markets. It felt in those years like Fry's could last forever. It couldn't, and the reasons why were already taking shape. Not in the market, not in the economy, but inside the company itself. Inside one office, in fact. Inside one man's desk. His name was Ausaf Umar Siddiqui, and for nearly 4 years, he was one of the most powerful people inside Fry's Electronics. His title was Vice President of Merchandising and Operations. His salary was $225,000 a year. He supervised a staff of 120 people, and his team was responsible for every single product that ended up on every single shelf in all 34 Fry's stores across America. Every vendor relationship, every purchasing decision, every deal struck between Fry's and the hundreds of suppliers whose products filled those themed palaces from floor to ceiling. In a privately held company where the Fry family kept decision-making tight and information tighter, Siddiqui had earned something rare: genuine trust. He was the man they had handed the keys to, the man who controlled what Fry's bought, how much they paid for it, and which vendors got premium placement on the most visible shelves in the store. It was, as it turned out, an enormous amount of power to give one person. Here is how the scheme worked. In normal retail operations, the relationship between a store and its suppliers runs through independent sales representatives, brokers who negotiate deals between both sides and earn a commission, typically between 3 and 8% of the total sale. The independence is intentional. A rep who works for neither party exclusively is less likely to favor one over the other. It keeps the system clean. Siddiqui convinced Fry's leadership that this arrangement was inefficient, that he could handle the broker function himself internally and save the company money in the process. It was a reasonable-sounding argument. They gave him the authority. What he built instead was a trap. Starting in January 2005, Siddiqui began approaching Fry's vendors with a proposition: pay him personally through a shell company he had created called PC International, and he would guarantee their products stayed on Fry's shelves. He would buy more of their inventory than normal. He would give them premium placement. In exchange, they paid him kickbacks of up to 31% of the total sales price. 5 vendors entered the arrangement. The payments flowed into PC International, and from PC International, the money flowed somewhere else entirely. Las Vegas. Ausaf Umar Siddiqui was a gambler, not in the casual sense, not the occasional weekend trip, not the modest losses that most people absorb and forget. Siddiqui was a high roller in the most literal meaning of the term. At MGM Grand and Las Vegas Sands, he was the kind of customer casinos built entire hospitality programs around. He demanded that casino staff leave golden raisins and bottles of Dom Perignon in his room before he arrived. He was known by name on the floors. He was treated like royalty. Between 2005 and 2008, Ausaf Umar Siddiqui gambled $162 million in Las Vegas casinos. Let that number sit for a moment. $162 million. Lost. Not wagered and recovered, but lost. Across casino floors while he simultaneously ran the merchandising operation of one of America's largest electronics retailers. He would later be listed among the largest individual gambling losers in the history of Las Vegas. The IRS, when they eventually built their case, found that $167.8 million had been deposited into PC International's bank accounts over the course of the scheme. Of that, $17.9 million went directly to subsidiaries of Las Vegas Sands. The money that came from Fry's vendor relationships, money that should have benefited the company, its pricing, its inventory quality, was being pumped almost in its entirety into casino accounts. The scheme unraveled the way so many do, not through sophisticated investigation, but through a moment of ordinary bad luck. In October 2008, another Fry's executive walked into Siddiqui's office while he was away. On the desk in plain sight were spreadsheets, commission structures, payment records, numbers that made no sense for a legitimate operation. The executive took the documents, walked out, and called the IRS. Federal agents examined Siddiqui's bank records. The picture that emerged was devastating. He was arrested. A criminal complaint was filed, alleging wire fraud and money laundering. The IRS set bond at $300,000. Siddiqui did not go quietly into the legal process. He delayed. He filed for personal bankruptcy in July 2011, listing $137 million in debt, including roughly $20 million owed directly to Las Vegas casinos. He owed additional gambling debts in Connecticut and Britain, amounts listed simply as unknown. On December 8, 2011, United States District Court Judge Jeremy Fogel sentenced him to 6 years in federal prison. A plea deal had prevented a longer sentence. Fry's placed its own damages from the scheme at approximately $87 million, but the financial figure, large as it was, missed the deeper wound. The vendors who had participated in Siddiqui's arrangement had done so under coercion, and some of them never got paid for inventory already delivered. The relationships Fry's had spent years building with its supplier network were fractured. Trust, once broken at that level, does not simply reset when the perpetrator goes to prison. The shelves at Fry's would never look quite the same again, not because anyone could see the damage immediately, but because the infrastructure underneath, the vendor confidence, the purchasing reliability, the implicit understanding that Fry's was a trustworthy partner, had been quietly hollowed out. Siddiqui took $87 million from Fry's balance sheet. What he actually stole was something harder to measure and impossible to recover. The Siddiqui scandal broke in late 2008. Fry's issued no public statement of substance, no press conference, no acknowledgement of what the scheme had cost the company beyond the legal proceedings themselves. The family closed ranks the way they always had, and the story faded from mainstream coverage within weeks. But inside the company, and inside the vendor relationships that kept those 34 stores stocked, something had permanently shifted. The damage wasn't visible from the outside, not yet. Customers still came. The themed stores still drew people in. The checkout lines were still long. On the surface, Fry's Electronics in 2009 looked like it always had. A sprawling, idiosyncratic retail empire doing exactly what it had always done. Beneath that surface, the cracks were spreading. The first crack had been there long before Siddiqui. It was the internet. In 1999, Amazon began selling electronics. Not as a major focus. Books were still the core business. But the category was open, the platform was scaling, and the pricing was sharp. For the kind of deep catalog, comparison-driven shopping that Fry's customers did naturally, the internet was not a complement to physical retail. It was a replacement for it. And Fry's, for reasons that were never fully explained publicly, was almost completely unprepared. In 2000, Fry's launched Frys.com. The purpose of the site at launch was not to sell electronics. It was to provide low-cost internet access to customers, a dial-up service. In the year 2000, when Amazon was already selling hard drives and processors online, Fry's answer to the digital economy was an ISP offering. The following year, in November 2001, Fry's acquired Siberian Outpost, an established e-commerce electronics retailer, for what should have been a transformative move. Siberian Outpost had infrastructure, customer base, and brand recognition in the online space. It was exactly the asset Fry's needed to compete digitally. Instead of integrating it, Fry's kept the Outpost.com URL separate from the Fry's brand entirely. Customers who knew Fry's had no reason to find Outpost.com. Customers who knew Outpost.com had no reason to connect it to Fry's. For a brief, bewildering period in the mid-2000s, the site identified itself as Fry's Electronics Outpost.com, a name that satisfied no one and clarified nothing. The opportunity dissolved in the confusion. By the time Fry's had a coherent, unified online presence, Amazon had spent a decade perfecting one-click purchasing, same-day delivery, and a customer experience that made driving 45 minutes to stand in a checkout line feel increasingly optional. The second crack was cultural, and it had been noted publicly as far back as 1997. That year, Forbes ran a report on Fry's customer service practices. The findings were specific and unflattering. Policies that appeared deliberately designed to make returns and refunds difficult. Tactics that frustrated customers at the point of resolution, the moment when a company either builds long-term loyalty or destroys it. USA Today and Wired followed with their own coverage in 1998. The criticism wasn't isolated or anecdotal. It was a documented pattern. For most of the 1990s and early 2000s, Fry's got away with it. The selection was unmatched. The experience was unique. Customers absorbed the friction because the alternative, not going to Fry's, was worse than tolerating it. But friction compounds. Every customer who fought for a refund and lost remembered it. Every long hold on a customer service line, every restocking fee applied without clear justification, every interaction that left someone feeling taken advantage of, these accumulated in the background, invisible on any balance sheet, waiting for the moment when the selection advantage disappeared and there was nothing left to absorb the cost of having treated people poorly for years. That moment was coming. It would just take a while longer to arrive. The third crack appeared on Black Friday, 2007, at the Renton, Washington location. Customers waiting in the notoriously long Fry's checkout line discovered that employees were offering to let people jump the queue for a fee, not unofficially, in whispers, openly enough that it spread through the line and made the local news within hours. Fry's management, to their credit, offered refunds to anyone who had paid. But the story landed exactly where it didn't need to land, as confirmation of something customers had long suspected: that the company's relationship with basic fairness was, at best, flexible. In 2008, the same year Siddiqui was arrested, the Federal Communications Commission fined Fry's $384,000 for failing to place legally required consumer alert labels on analog televisions. The same year, a VP running an $87 million kickback scheme and an FCC fine for labeling violations. 2008 was not a good year to be inside Fry's Electronics. In 2012, Fry's settled a sexual harassment and retaliation lawsuit brought by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for $2.3 million. An assistant store manager had harassed a sales associate. The company had retaliated against her when she reported it. The settlement required Fry's to implement preventive measures. Whether those measures changed the underlying culture was a question the company never answered publicly. Each of these events, taken individually, was survivable. Companies absorb scandals, they settle lawsuits, they pay fines and move on. But Fry's wasn't absorbing these hits cleanly. It was carrying them, piling them on top of an increasingly outdated digital strategy, a damaged vendor network, and a physical footprint so large that any meaningful course correction would require capital and will in roughly equal measure. The Fry family had the stores, they had the brand, they had the loyalty of customers who still showed up because memory is powerful and habit is hard to break. What they were running out of was time. And somewhere in the boardroom, or whatever passed for a boardroom in a company this private, this insular, this resistant to outside input, a decision was being formed. A decision that would take everything that was already wrong with Fry's Electronics and accelerate it past the point of recovery. At some point in the mid-2010s, someone inside Fry's Electronics looked at the balance sheet and made a decision. The company was carrying too much inventory risk, buying products outright, paying vendors up front, stocking shelves, hoping the merchandise moved before it became obsolete, was expensive. Margins were tightening. Amazon was undercutting on price with an efficiency that a physical retailer operating 34 giant theme buildings simply could not match. Best Buy had restructured, streamlined, gotten leaner. Fry's had done none of those things. The solution they landed on was consignment. Under a consignment model, Fry's would no longer purchase inventory outright. Vendors would ship products to the stores, the products would sit on shelves, and Fry's would only pay the vendor after a sale was made. The financial logic was straightforward. Eliminate the capital tied up in unsold stock, reduce inventory risk, free up cash flow. On a spreadsheet in a conference room with no customers present, it probably looked like a reasonable pivot. What it looked like in practice was something else entirely. The problem was incentive structure. When a retailer pays for inventory up front, vendors have every reason to send their best products, the newest models, the competitive SKUs, the items that will actually sell. The retailer is a paying customer. You take care of paying customers. Under consignment, that equation inverts. Fry's was no longer a paying customer. It was a storage facility that might eventually generate revenue. Vendors, who had plenty of other options, including Best Buy, Costco, Walmart, Target, and Amazon's third-party marketplace, had no compelling reason to prioritize a chain that wasn't paying them until after the sale. So they didn't. They sent what they had left over. Older models, slower-moving SKUs, products they couldn't place elsewhere. And then, as Fry's financial situation became less certain and rumors began circulating in vendor networks about payment reliability, Many vendors stopped sending products altogether. The shelves began to empty, not overnight, not dramatically in a single visible collapse. It happened the way most retail death spirals happen. Gradually, then suddenly, in a pattern that was obvious in retrospect and somehow invisible to the people making the decisions in real time. By 2018, customers shopping at Fry's locations across the country were posting photos online. Forum threads on Reddit and tech communities began filling with first-hand accounts. A customer at the Burbank store reported finding one CPU in stock, a low-end Ryzen 0 motherboards of any kind, DDR2 and DDR3 RAM that belonged in a museum, 0 graphics cards, 0 pre-built desktops, and 3 open-box monitors that weren't competitively priced. A customer in Indianapolis described a store that was mostly empty, with employees assuring them that new stock was coming soon. A shopper in Concord, California, visited 3 weeks after Black Friday and found bare shelves in every single department. People started going to Fry's not to shop, but to document. Reddit threads with titles like "The Creepy Empty Fry's" accumulated hundreds of responses. YouTube videos of people walking through ghost-like stores, panning across empty fixtures and isolated display models, racked up views. The stores that had once been destinations, places people drove an hour to reach, were becoming spectacles of a different kind. Not "look how amazing this place is," but "look what's happening to it." The vendor side of the story was even darker. Multiple vendors came forward publicly to describe what the consignment transition had actually looked like from their end. One vendor account posted on an industry forum described receiving contact from Fry's about switching to consignment, and being told, in effect, that agreeing to consignment was the condition for receiving payment on invoices already owed from 2018. "We're not paying what we owe you," the implicit message ran, "unless you agree to our new terms." A vendor who pushed back described the dynamic plainly. "What they were doing was extortion. We told them we weren't interested in consignment. They basically said, if you want to get paid, you have to sign up." Another vendor described the downstream consequence. Even after agreeing to consignment terms, Fry's fell behind on payments. Shipments sent in good faith sat in stores for weeks without generating payment. The vendors who had trusted Fry's were now owed money they weren't sure they'd ever see, with inventory they couldn't retrieve sitting inside store that were visibly declining. The word spread through vendor networks the way bad credit spreads through a small town. You don't have to tell everyone explicitly. People talk, meetings happen, and the collective decision, made independently by dozens of suppliers, was the same. We're not sending our best product to Fry's. We're not sending anything we can't afford to lose. Fry's responded to the public scrutiny the only way it knew how: denial. On September 10, 2019, the Mercury News published a report on the empty shelves, citing customers across multiple locations and asking the direct question: was Fry's about to close? The company's official response was measured and firm. They were transitioning to a consignment model. This was a deliberate strategic shift. No stores were closing except the Palo Alto location, which was simply a lease expiration. Everything was under control. Nobody believed it. The customers who had watched the shelves empty over 18 months didn't believe it. The vendors who were owed money didn't believe it. The employees who were standing inside those vast, themed, half-empty buildings every day, answering questions from confused shoppers with answers they knew weren't true, definitely didn't believe it. And the stores kept closing. December 2019, the Palo Alto location, the Wild West store, one of the originals, shut its doors. January 2020, the Duluth, Georgia location closed without advance notice during the holiday season. Customers arrived to find it locked. No warning had been given. February 2020, Anaheim followed. November 2020, the Campbell store, the Egyptian pyramid, closed abruptly and permanently. 4 stores gone in 13 months, 30 remaining. And COVID-19, which had arrived in March 2020, was being used as the public explanation for difficulties that had begun years before the first case was reported. The pandemic was not the cause of what was happening to Fry's Electronics. It was a curtain, one that allowed a company in an advanced state of collapse to point at an external catastrophe and say this is why, while the real reasons accumulated quietly behind it. By the end of 2020, Fry's had approximately 260 employees, down from the 14,000 that had worked there at peak. The stores that remained open were operating with skeleton crews, stocking consignment inventory that vendors were increasingly reluctant to provide, inside buildings that cost enormous amounts of money to heat, cool, and maintain. The math no longer worked. It probably hadn't worked for years. The only question left was when and how the end would come. The last day did not announce itself. There was no press release drafted weeks in advance. No all-hands meeting where leadership gathered employees and explained what was coming. No going out of business sale. No clearance signage. No final weekend where loyal customers could walk the aisles one last time and say goodbye to the UFO in Burbank, or the Aztec temple in Phoenix, or the Egyptian pyramid in Campbell that was already gone. There was just a Tuesday evening. And then, without warning, everything ended. By early February 2021, the remaining Fry's stores had settled into a rhythm that felt less like retail and more like waiting. The shelves that had once held tens of thousands of products were now populated by isolated items. A few televisions here, a row of cables there, display models standing in for inventory that was never coming. Employees who had worked at Fry's for years, in some cases for decades, were showing up to buildings that bore almost no resemblance to what they had originally signed up to work in. The customers who still came did so out of habit or hope, or the particular kind of stubbornness that makes people return to places they love long after those places have stopped deserving it. Some came to browse empty shelves and leave without buying anything. Some came to take photographs. The internet had been documenting Fry's decline for 2 years, and the stores had become, for a certain kind of observer, a real-time exhibit on the death of a retail era. No one knew that the exhibit was about to close permanently. On the evening of February 23, 2021, the first rumors appeared online. Posts on Reddit and Twitter, sourced from people who claimed to be current Fry's employees, began circulating shortly after 9 p.m. Pacific time. The claim was specific. Fry's was closing all remaining stores. Immediately, not at the end of the month. Not after a wind-down period. Tonight. The post spread fast. Within 30 minutes, the thread had thousands of views. People who had grown up going to Fry's, people who had built their first computers with parts sourced from those stores, people who had fond memories of midnight launches and hour-long checkout lines in buildings shaped like alien crash sites. They were all watching the same feeds, asking the same question. Is this real? At approximately 9:47 p.m., Bay Area broadcaster KRON TV confirmed it. Multiple sources inside the company had verified. Fry's Electronics was shutting down. All stores, immediately. The wind down was beginning tonight. What followed in the next 2 hours was the digital equivalent of watching a building be demolished in real time. Fry's Electronics deleted its Facebook page. Not deactivated, deleted. 1.31 million followers. 36 years of company history, product announcements, store events, and customer interactions. Gone in a single administrative action, sometime before 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The page that had existed since Facebook was a relevant platform for retail brands simply ceased to exist. The company's Twitter account, which had accumulated 35,700 followers at its peak, was set to protected status. No new followers could see the content. No public could read the feed. The account went dark without a final post, without an explanation, without so much as a farewell. At 11:59 p.m., the Fry's.com website was still live. At 12:00 a.m. on February 24, 2021, it wasn't. The site that had existed in some form since 2000, the site that had sold internet access, then acquired Siberian Outpost, then spent 2 decades trying to figure out what an electronics retailer's online presence should look like, went offline at midnight. In its place, a single page, white background, a brief letter. After nearly 36 years in business as the one-stop shop and online resource for high-tech professionals across 9 states and 31 stores, Fry's Electronics, Inc. today made the difficult decision to shut down its operations and close its business permanently. The letter cited changes in the retail industry and the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. It thanked customers. It provided contact information for people with equipment currently in for repair and for vendors with consignment inventory still inside the stores. It did not mention the employees. Wednesday morning, February 24th, came cold and ordinary in cities across 9 states. In Burbank, California, a customer drove to the store with a UFO crash landing through its wall. The parking lot was empty. The doors were locked. A handwritten note had been taped to the glass. In San Jose, a man who had worked at Fry's for 15 years drove to his store out of habit. Because when you've done something for 15 years, your body goes there before your mind catches up. He stood in the parking lot for a while. Then he drove home. In Houston, a small vendor who had consignment inventory inside the Texas store sent an email to the address provided in the farewell letter. He was asking how to retrieve approximately $4,000 worth of product that was now inside a locked building. He would not receive a reply for several weeks. Across America on that Wednesday morning, 30 store locations shut simultaneously. The 4 that had closed earlier in 2019 and 2020 had at least come with some warning. A lease expiration announced in advance, a regional closure that gave employees a few weeks. These 30 came with nothing. The employees who had not seen the Tuesday night news reports found out when they arrived at work and discovered the doors would not open. No severance package was publicly confirmed. No transition assistance was announced. The farewell letter on the website directed customers and vendors to email addresses and phone numbers. For the thousands of people who had worked inside those buildings, some for 5 years, some for 20, there was no equivalent direction, no next step, no acknowledgement that they had existed at all beyond the line in the letter about nearly 36 years in business. What remained in the days and weeks that followed was silence. The themed buildings, built at enormous expense, designed to be unlike anything else in American retail, each one a physical argument that shopping could be an experience worth having, stood empty along the streets and highways where they had always stood. The UFO in Burbank still jutted from the wall. The Aztec temple in Phoenix still rose against the desert sky. The circuit board motifs in Sunnyvale still ran along surfaces that no one was walking past anymore. Inside, the shelves that had held hundreds of thousands of products at Fry's peak now held almost nothing. The snack bars were dark. The checkout lanes were empty. The ambient jungle sounds that had once played through hidden speakers in the Phoenix store were silent. 30 buildings, 30 sets of locked doors, 30 parking lots going quiet on a Wednesday morning in February, while the rest of the world went about its day without fully registering that something had ended. Not just a company, not just a retail chain, a place, a specific, irreplaceable, deeply strange, and genuinely beloved place that a generation of engineers, builders, hobbyists, and dreamers had called their own. It was gone before most of them had the chance to say goodbye. In the weeks after the closure, the narrative that formed in mainstream coverage was clean and familiar. A beloved retail chain, already weakened by the rise of e-commerce, was finally pushed over the edge by a global pandemic. COVID-19 had closed stores, kept customers home, accelerated the shift to online shopping, and delivered the killing blow to a company that had been fighting the inevitable for years. It was a reasonable story. It was also incomplete, because Fry's Electronics did not die from a single cause. It died from 5, each one serious on its own, each one compounding the others, each one traceable not to market forces beyond anyone's control, but to decisions made by specific people inside the company over the course of 2 decades. Understanding what actually killed Fry's matters because the same combination of failures is available to any company that chooses to ignore it. The first cause? The online blind spot Amazon began selling electronics in 1999. By 2005, it was the dominant online destination for consumer electronics, with pricing, selection, and delivery infrastructure that no physical retailer could match dollar for dollar. The window for a major brick-and-mortar chain to build a credible digital presence, not to beat Amazon, but to coexist with it, was roughly 2000 to 2008. 8 years of opportunity. Fry's spent those 8 years in confusion. The 2000 website launch offered internet access, not product sales. The 2001 Siberian Outpost acquisition, which should have been the foundation of a genuine e-commerce operation, was mishandled so completely that the brand ran under a separate URL for years, invisible to the millions of customers who knew Fry's but had no reason to find Outpost.com. By the time Fry's had a unified, functional online retail presence, the window had closed. Amazon owned the space. Best Buy had adapted. Fry's had a website that felt like an afterthought attached to a business model that hadn't changed since 1985. This was not bad luck. It was a series of deliberate choices made by leadership that either didn't understand the digital transition or chose not to prioritize it. In a privately held company with no external accountability, there was no board to push back. No shareholder meeting where someone stood up and asked why Fry's online strategy was years behind every competitor. The Fry family made their decisions in private and lived with the consequences in private, until those consequences became impossible to contain. The second cause, the Siddiqui wound. The $87 million in direct damages from the Siddiqui scheme was devastating on its own terms. For a privately held retailer operating on the thin margins that consumer electronics retail produces, $87 million is not an abstraction. It is inventory that wasn't purchased. It is store renovations that didn't happen. It is technology investments that were deferred. It is, in very concrete terms, years of operational capacity simply removed from the company. But the financial damage, large as it was the smaller part of the wound. What Siddiqui actually destroyed was the vendor trust that Fry's had spent nearly 2 decades building. The suppliers who had participated in his kickback arrangement, some knowingly, some under coercion, emerged from the scandal with complicated feelings about Fry's as a business partner. The vendors who had been pushed out of shelf space by Siddiqui's rigged system emerged with grievances that legal proceedings did not fully resolve. The broader vendor community, watching the criminal case unfold, updated their assessment of Fry's as a reliable partner. You cannot put a number on vendor trust. It doesn't appear on a balance sheet, but it is the invisible infrastructure of every retail operation. The reason suppliers send their newest products to one chain and their leftovers to another. The reason payment terms are extended or tightened. The reason a phone call gets returned or doesn't. When Siddiqui went to prison, Fry's got its VP back in the abstract sense. What it never got back was the network of relationships he had spent 4 years corrupting. The empty shelves that appeared a decade later were, in part, the delayed invoice for that corruption finally coming due. The third cause, family insularity. Fry's Electronics was a private company, and the Fry family exercised the full privileges of private ownership throughout its existence. No public financials, no outside board members with meaningful authority, no investor pressure to modernize, restructure, or address problems that were visible to everyone except, apparently, the people making the decisions. This insularity had genuine advantages in the early years. It allowed the family to build a deeply idiosyncratic retail concept without answering to shareholders who would have demanded conformity. It protected the themed store vision from the kind of cost-cutting that would have stripped out everything that made Fry's distinctive. But insularity is only an advantage when the people at the center of it are making good decisions. When they aren't, when the online strategy is years behind the market, when the vendor network is deteriorating, when the consignment model is visibly destroying the in-store experience, private ownership becomes a sealed chamber where bad decisions echo without correction. There was no mechanism inside Fry's to force a reckoning. No outside voice with the authority to say, this isn't working, and here is what needs to change. The family built a wall around the company to protect it. By the end, that wall was keeping the solutions out. The fourth cause, the cathedral trap. The theme stores were the soul of Fry's. They were also financially a set of anchors. Each location was a massive, custom-built structure, not a generic big-box shell that could be repurposed or subleased without difficulty, but a building with a UFO through its wall, or a pyramid rising from its roof, or jungle sounds piped through its ventilation system. These were not assets that transferred easily. They were expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and nearly impossible to exit gracefully when the business case for them deteriorated. As revenue declined, the fixed costs of operating 34 enormous themed buildings did not decline with it. Lease obligations ran for years. Utilities scaled with square footage, not with sales. The very size that had made Fry's feel like a destination, the 50,000, 60,000, 80,000 square foot floor plans that allowed them to stock everything, became a trap when the inventory to fill that space stopped arriving. A smaller retailer facing the same pressures could have closed underperforming locations quickly, consolidated into a tighter footprint, and restructured around the stores that were still working. Fry's could not move that way. The buildings were too large, too customized, too expensive to exit cleanly. So the stores stayed open, burning through capital, long after the rational decision would have been to close them. The fifth cause, the identity erasure. At its peak, Fry's had a clear identity. It was the store for people who took technology seriously. The selection, the depth, the components, the technical books, the midnight launches, everything pointed at a specific customer and said, "This place is for you." By 2019, that identity had been replaced by makeup displays and fragrance counters, filling the space where graphics cards used to be. The consignment model had not just emptied the shelves, it had handed the curation of those shelves to whoever was willing to consign product, regardless of whether it belonged in a tech store. Fry's, which had built its entire business on being the right store for a specific kind of customer, had become a store for no one in particular. When your best customers, the engineers, the builders, the hobbyists who had driven an hour to browse your aisles at midnight, arrive and find perfume testers where the motherboards used to be, they don't get angry. They just stop coming. And they tell the people in their communities, who tell the people in theirs, and the word that spreads is not Fry's is struggling. The word that spreads is Fry's is already gone. You just haven't heard yet. The verdict, COVID-19 did not kill Fry's Electronics. It closed a store that was already empty. What killed Fry's was a decade of missed digital opportunities, compounded by a corruption scandal that destroyed vendor relationships, compounded by a family ownership structure that had no mechanism for self-correction, compounded by a physical footprint too large and too customized to escape, compounded by a final strategic decision that stripped the store of the identity that had made it worth saving in the first place. Any one of these alone was survivable. Together they were not. The irony is that Fry's was not killed by forces it couldn't see. Every one of these problems was visible, documented, and discussed. In press coverage, in customer forums, in vendor complaints, in the financial logic of a consignment model that anyone could see wasn't working. The information was available. The conclusions were obvious. The decision to act on them just never came. After the doors locked on February 24, 2021, the buildings remained. That was the part nobody had fully thought through. When a retail chain closes, the merchandise gets liquidated, the employees disperse, the brand dissolves into memory. But the physical structures, the walls, the roofs, the parking lots, the custom architectural installations that had cost millions of dollars and years of construction, those don't simply disappear because the company that built them is gone. Fry's Electronics left behind 30 locations across 9 states. 30 enormous buildings, most of them custom-built to house a specific retail vision that no longer existed. 30 sets of locked doors in strip malls and standalone lots along highways and commercial corridors from California to Georgia, each one now a very large, very expensive, very specific kind of problem. Nobody wanted them. That was the brutal commercial reality of the theme store concept when stripped of its purpose. A 60,000 square foot building with a UFO crash landing through its exterior wall is not a neutral space. You cannot walk a prospective tenant through that building and say, imagine what you could do with this, without the prospective tenant immediately thinking about what it would cost to undo what was already there. The custom facades, the architectural installations, the sheer scale of the floor plans, all of it made the Fry's locations among the most difficult commercial real estate to repurpose in the markets where they sat. Some buildings were absorbed relatively quickly into the industrial and logistics economy that had been expanding rapidly since the pandemic accelerated e-commerce demand. Warehouse operators and distribution companies needed large footprints, and large footprints were available. But these transactions took time, involved extensive renovation, and said nothing complimentary about the trajectory of American retail. Others sat empty for years. The Sunnyvale store, the original, the one on Arquis Avenue where John, Randy, David, and Catherine Calder had opened the first Fry's Electronics on May 17, 1985, sat vacant for more than 2 years after the closure. The building where the entire chain had begun, where Silicon Valley engineers had first discovered that a store could take them seriously, where the circuit board motifs and semiconductor imagery had made tech culture feel like something worth celebrating. That building spent those years accumulating weeds in its parking lot, its formerly bright green waveform sign bleaching white on the exterior wall. In September 2023, semiconductor equipment manufacturer Applied Materials purchased the site. Their plans for the building were not publicly disclosed. The place where Fry's Electronics was born is now owned by a company that makes the machines that make the chips. A closing of a loop that would feel meaningful if the circumstances surrounding it were less melancholy. The Burbank store, the one with the 1950s science fiction theme, the one where a full-scale UFO had crashed through the exterior wall and stopped traffic on the street outside for decades, found a second life of a specific and fitting kind. In 2022, director Jordan Peele chose the empty Burbank Fry's as a filming location for his film Nope, a movie about, among other things, the uncanny, the abandoned, and the things that loom at the edges of perception without ever being fully explained. The store that had once been a destination for midnight GPU launches and hour-long checkout lines became a film set, its emptied interior and iconic exterior serving as backdrop for a story about dread and spectacle. It was, in its way, a perfect ending for that building. Fry's Electronics had always been slightly uncanny, too large, too strange, too committed to its own internal logic to fit neatly into any standard retail category. An abandoned Fry's as a horror film location felt less like irony and more like completion. The employees who had worked inside these buildings faced a quieter and more difficult aftermath. At the time of closure, Fry's had approximately 2,260 people on its payroll, down from the roughly 14,000 who had worked there at peak, a reduction that had happened gradually over the preceding 2 years through a combination of store closures and the kind of quiet attrition that happens when a company stops feeling like a stable place to build a career. The 2,260 who remained when the doors closed on February 24th received no publicly confirmed severance package. No transition program was announced. The farewell letter on the website addressed customers and vendors. The people who had shown up to work every day, who had stood in those themed buildings answering questions and managing inventory and running checkout lines, they were directed to no specific resource. Some found positions quickly. Tech retail experience, even from a declining chain, translated to customer-facing roles at Best Buy, Micro Center, and the growing network of consumer electronics departments inside larger general retailers. Others moved into warehouse and logistics work, a sector that was hiring aggressively in 2021. Some left retail entirely. For a certain subset, the long-tenure employees, the ones who had been at Fry's for 10 or 15 years, who had built their professional identity around a specific store in a specific themed building, the closure was a loss that went beyond employment. It was the removal of a context, a place they had known, a community they had been part of, however imperfect that community had become toward the end. For the customers, the loss registered differently but ran just as deep. Fry's Electronics had occupied a specific and irreplaceable cultural position for the generation of engineers and hobbyists who had grown up alongside it. The forums and communities where that generation gathered, Reddit threads, tech enthusiast boards, YouTube comment sections, filled in the weeks and months after the closure with a specific kind of retrospective that retail chains rarely inspire. People wrote about their first PC builds, about components sourced entirely from Fry's, assembled on kitchen tables, booted for the first time with the particular anxiety of not knowing if it would work. About driving an hour to the Burbank store for a midnight GPU launch and standing in line with strangers who shared exactly the same obsession, about the smell of fresh circuit boards and snack bar popcorn, about checkout lines that took 45 minutes and felt, in memory, less like an inconvenience and more like part of the ritual. Micro Centers still operated locations in select markets, and for customers near those locations, something of the experience survived. Newegg continued as an online retailer. The components and products that Fry's had once stocked were still available, more available than ever, through channels faster and cheaper than a physical store could offer. But the experience was gone. The specific combination of scale and selection and strangeness and commitment, the feeling of walking into a building that had been built at real cost, with real conviction, to tell a specific kind of customer that their passion was worth taking seriously. That didn't transfer to a website. It didn't transfer to a cleaner, more efficient, more rationally organized competitor. It existed in those specific buildings, and when the buildings closed, it ended. The parking lots are empty now. The facades are fading. The UFO in Burbank still juts from the wall of a building that no longer sells anything. The Aztec temple in Phoenix still stands against the desert sky. Inside, silence. Empty shelves. The ghost of a place that was, for a long time, exactly what it claimed to be. There is a version of the Fry's electronics story that ends with a simple moral. Brick and mortar retail couldn't survive the internet, and Fry's was just another casualty of an inevitable transition. It's a clean conclusion. It's also wrong. Micro Center is still open. It operates physical stores. It sells the same categories Fry's sold: computers, components, peripherals, electronics, at comparable prices to the same kinds of customers in buildings that require employees and leases and all the fixed costs that supposedly make physical retail unviable. Micro Center is not struggling. It is, by most available indicators, thriving. The difference between Micro Center and Fry's Electronics is not that one sold products in a building and one didn't. The difference is in every decision made between the founding and the closing. And those decisions, examined honestly, carry lessons that extend well beyond the specific story of a themed electronics chain in Silicon Valley. Nostalgia is not a business model. Fry's Electronics had something genuinely rare: a customer base that loved it, not just preferred it, not just chose it for convenience, but loved it in the way people love places that have shaped their lives. The engineers who built their first computers with Fry's components, the hobbyists who spent Saturday afternoons in those themed aisles, the IT professionals who treated Fry's as a reliable extension of their own supply chains. That love was real, and for a long time, it was enough to absorb the friction, the bad customer service, the long checkout lines, the return policy frustrations, the vendor kickback scandal that made the news for a few weeks and then faded. But love is not unconditional in retail. It is conditional on the store continuing to be the thing you love it for. When the shelves emptied, when the components gave way to perfume testers, when the experience that had generated the loyalty in the first place ceased to exist, the love remained, but its object was gone. Customers kept going to Fry's out of habit and hope long after Fry's had stopped deserving either. Eventually, they stopped going. The lesson is uncomfortable because it implies that loyalty is not an asset you can spend indefinitely. It is an asset you have to keep earning. Fry's stopped earning it and assumed it would persist anyway. It didn't. One person with unchecked access can undo decades of work. Ausaf Umar Siddiqui was one man. He held one position. He ran one scheme for less than 4 years. And the damage he caused: $87 million in direct losses, a corrupted vendor network, fractured supplier relationships that never fully healed, echoed through the company for the remaining 13 years of its existence. The structural failure that enabled him was straightforward: a privately held company with tight family control and no independent oversight gave a single executive control over both the broker function and the purchasing function, two roles that exist separately in healthy organizations specifically to prevent what Siddiqui did. The Fry family trusted him. He exploited that trust comprehensively. The lesson is not that trust is wrong. It is that trust without structure is a vulnerability. In any organization where one person controls enough of the financial machinery, the question is not whether abuse is possible. It is whether the systems exist to catch it before it runs for 4 years and costs $87 million. At Fry's, those systems did not exist. Another executive stumbled onto the evidence by accident on a Tuesday afternoon because the documents happened to be sitting on a desk when the wrong person walked in. That is not a compliance program. That is luck. And luck in this case came about 3 years too late. Secrecy protects decisions from correction. The Fry family's choice to keep their company entirely private was their right. But rights and consequences are different things. The same privacy that protected their vision in the founding years became, in the declining years, a barrier between the company and every external voice that might have forced a reckoning. There was no board of directors with independent authority to look at the online strategy in 2005 and demand an explanation for why Fry's was losing the digital decade. There was no investor with enough stake to push back against the consignment decision when the evidence of its failure was already visible in 2018. There was no accountability structure of any kind that required the people making decisions to defend those decisions to anyone outside the family. What fills that vacuum is not wisdom. It is the compounding of whatever errors the leadership is already inclined to make, insulated from the friction that outside perspective provides. Every organization needs someone who can say, with real authority, with real consequences, this is not working. Fry's built a structure that made that impossible. The decisions that followed were exactly what you would expect from a structure designed to prevent correction. The experience was the business. When the experience died, the business died with it. This is the lesson that cuts deepest, because it was the most preventable and the most completely ignored. Fry's Electronics was not, at its core, a logistics operation. It was not primarily a price competitor. It was an experience, a specific, physical, irreplaceable experience that existed nowhere else, and that customers had organized genuine affection around for decades. The themed buildings, the midnight launches, the depth of selection, the feeling of walking into a space that had been built with real conviction for a specific kind of person, that was the product. Not the televisions, not the cables, the experience itself. Every major decision Fry's made in its final decade degraded that experience. The consignment model emptied the shelves. The failure to renovate aged the buildings. The identity drift, components replaced by cosmetics, tech replaced by whatever vendor was willing to consign, hollowed out the reason the stores existed. And once the experience was gone, there was nothing left to compete on. Amazon had better prices. Best Buy had better service. Micro Center had better selection. Fry's had empty shelves inside a building with a UFO on the wall. The tragedy is not that the experience ended. Everything ends. The tragedy is that it didn't have to end this way. Not this abruptly, not this emptily, not with locked doors on a Wednesday morning, and no goodbye to the people who had built their professional lives inside those buildings. It ended the way it did because the people responsible for maintaining the experience stopped understanding what the experience was. They saw a retail operation, square footage, inventory turns, vendor terms, lease obligations. Their customers saw something else entirely. They saw the place where they had become who they were. Somewhere in Burbank, California, the UFO is still there. It juts from the wall of a building that has been empty for years, on a street where people still slow down sometimes to look at it. Not because they're interested in what's inside. They know nothing is inside. But because the thing itself is still remarkable, still committed, still insisting in its inanimate way that something worth noticing once happened here. Fry's Electronics was open for 36 years. It employed tens of thousands of people. It shaped the tech culture of a generation. It built 34 of the strangest, most distinctive, most genuinely beloved retail spaces America has ever produced. And then it threw all of that away. Not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, through a long series of decisions that prioritized the wrong things, trusted the wrong people, and failed to protect the one thing that could never be rebuilt once it was gone: the experience. The only thing that was ever really for sale at Fry's Electronics wasn't on any shelf. And when they lost sight of that, they lost everything.